On the evening of February 3, 2026, hundreds of gunmen arrived on motorcycles at dusk in the villages of Woro and Nuku in Kayama local government area, Kwara State. They had been there before, not with guns, with letters. 2 weeks before the attack, they sent letters and pamphlets to the village of Woro, warning what was coming. 5 months before the attack, they had written to the village head informing him they intended to preach there. The Ilorin council received notice of the letter and requested soldiers be deployed. The soldiers came, and then they withdrew after a few weeks. The final warning letter arrived in January 2026. It was addressed by Boko Haram under its formal name and signed by its leader in Lake Chad, Bakura. Nobody came. On February 3rd, the gunmen arrived. They bound the hands of villagers. They fired rifles at close range. They burned homes, burnt shops, burnt the palace of the village head. They killed the chief imam of Woro. They killed a school principal. They killed a headmistress. They killed school children. They abducted 38 people, predominantly women and children. The village head of Woro, Alhaji Saliu Umar, lost 3 of his children in the attack. His wife was kidnapped. His palace was razed to the ground. The Red Cross documented 162 dead. Search operations for additional bodies were ongoing. Some estimates put the figure higher at 175. This was not a bandit attack motivated by ransom. The attackers had written letters. They had preached in the village. They had issued an ultimatum. They demanded that the residents of Waro and Nuku abandon their allegiance to the Nigerian state and adopt their version of Sharia law. Waro and Nuku were predominantly Muslim communities. They were not Christian villages caught in sectarian warfare. They were Muslim Yoruba communities practicing the tolerant, syncretic Islam that has characterized Kwara State for generations, who said no to militant extremism, who refused to submit to an ideology they did not recognize as their own faith. And they were massacred for that refusal. Now, understand what this means for Nigeria in 2026. Jihadist armed groups, whether you call them Lakurawa, Boko Haram, ISWAP, or the Islamic State Sahel province, are no longer contained in the northeast. They are no longer a Borno state problem, or a Yobe state problem, or a Lake Chad basin problem. They have moved. They are in Kwara State. They are in Kebbi State. They are in Niger State. They are at the edge of Kogi. They have sent letters to communities in the southwest corridor. They have established forest bases in Kainji National Park, a 5,341 square kilometer reserve that has become, by documented account, a sanctuary for a convergence of armed groups, including criminal bandits, Boko Haram factions, Ansaru, Lakurawa, and the Sahel-based JNIM. They have been building this infrastructure while successive Nigerian governments deployed troops, issued condemnations, and promised to checkmate the barbaric terrorists for 18 years. The troops have been deployed, the condemnations have been issued, the promises have been made. And on February 3, 2026, 162 people were bound, shot at close range, and burned in a village that had written letters to the authorities asking for protection, and watched the protection walk away after a few weeks. The question this investigation is going to answer is not whether Nigeria is at war. The documented evidence answers that question. The question is, what kind of war is this? Who is actually winning it? And what the Nigerian state's response across 18 years of insurgency, across 6 military administrations, across 6 presidents, across hundreds of billions of naira in defense expenditure, actually reveal about whether this country has the institutional capacity and the political will to protect its citizens from what is now advancing towards its geographic center. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let me establish the precise geography of the threat. because geography is where strategy lives, and understanding where these groups are operating reveals something about their trajectory that the news cycle's focus on individual incidents consistently obscures. Lakurawa entered Nigeria from Mali in 2017, initially presenting itself as a self-defense force helping communities fight criminal bandits. Founded in the Gongono forest of Tangaza in Sokoto State, it started with fewer than 50 local youths. Its ranks grew to over 200, predominantly men aged 18 to 35, recruited through stipends and radical teachings. By 2023, it had become a greater problem to the communities it had claimed to protect than the bandits it had claimed to fight. It raised taxes, it attacked security forces, it imposed Islamist laws, it killed civilians who refused compliance. By November 2024, Nigeria officially designated Lakurawa a terrorist organization. By this point, it had presence across approximately 500 villages. The U.S. Christmas Day 2025 strikes, Tomahawk missiles launched from the USS Paul Ignatius in the Gulf of Guinea, targeted 2 Lakurawa and ISWAP camps in the Baoni forest in Tangaza, Sokoto State. 155 and 200 fighters were killed, according to AFRICOM's assessment. Those strikes were conducted on December 25th. The Waro and Nuku massacre happened on February 3rd, 40 days later. The strikes degraded capacity. They did not end the campaign. Now, look at Boko Haram's parallel advance in the northeast. In October 2025, Boko Haram seized the Nigerian border town of Kirawa in Borno State, burning the district head's palace, a military barracks, and dozens of homes, forcing more than 5,000 people to flee into Cameroon. Residents described Kirawa as deserted and under insurgent control. In November 2025, 25 schoolgirls were abducted from a Catholic school in Kebbi State. 303 schoolchildren and 12 teachers were kidnapped from another Catholic school in Niger State. On June 21, 2025, a suspected female suicide bomber killed 12 people at a Friday night fish market in Borno State. On September 5, 2025, 63 people, including 7 soldiers, were killed in attacks in Darul Jamal, Borno State. Now, map all of this geographically. Borno, northeast; Kebbi, northwest; Niger, north-central; Kwara, north-central, bordering Kogi, Osun, Oyo, and Ekiti. The trajectory is not random. It is a progressive southward and westward expansion from the established northeast insurgency heartland toward the population and economic centers of north-central and southwestern Nigeria. The Kainji National Park, which straddles Kwara and Niger State, is the geographic key to this expansion. It is a vast, minimally patrolled forest reserve whose terrain allows armed groups to move across state lines without detection, establish logistics bases, conduct attacks, and retreat before conventional security forces can mobilize. Dr. Aisha Bello, a senior counter-terrorism analyst quoted in the reporting, described it precisely. These groups exploit poorly monitored corridors between states. Their attacks overwhelm local defenses before conventional forces can react. This is not a secret assessment. It is in the public domain. The Shiroro cell in Niger State has been documented as operational since at least 2021. The Kainji Forest Sanctuary has been identified in multiple security assessments. The cross-border corridors have been mapped by researchers and journalists. The intelligence was available. The warnings were written in letters that communities sent to authorities who deployed troops and then withdrew them after a few weeks. And 162 people were killed in Waro and Nuku on February 3, 2026. Now, examine the Woro and Nuku attack in its full documented detail. Because what happened in those villages is not only a security incident, it is a political declaration. The attackers did not arrive silently. They announced themselves months in advance. They sent theological missionaries first, preachers who went into Woro and demanded that residents abandon allegiance to the Nigerian state and adopt their version of Sharia. They established a pattern in border villages in Niger State first, preaching, demanding, building compliance before moving southward. When Woro and Nuku refused, They did not simply raid and leave. They executed systematically, with bound hands at close range, in a pattern that Amnesty International described as retaliatory executions designed to cow communities into submission. The chief imam died, not a Christian pastor, the chief imam of Woro, a Muslim religious leader who led Friday prayers in a Muslim-majority community. He was killed because his community refused the attacker's version of Islam, not because he practiced a different faith. This is the dimension that the binary Christian persecution framing of the international discourse consistently misses, and that this investigation must name clearly. This is not a war against Christians. It is a war against every Nigerian, Muslim, Christian, traditional, who refuses submission to a specific jihadist ideology. The Waro and Nuku communities were predominantly Muslim. Their chief imam was killed alongside their school children. The targeting criterion is not religion as commonly practiced. It is resistance to a specific totalitarian religious political project that demands total submission or death. That distinction is analytically essential, not because it reduces the documented severity of the threat to Christian communities, which is real and documented, but because it defines the actual adversary correctly. An adversary that kills Muslims who practice the wrong version of Islam, kills Christians who practice any version of Christianity, and kills community leaders who maintain loyalty to the Nigerian state is an adversary whose ambition is total territorial and ideological control, not merely the elimination of one religious community. Understanding the adversary correctly is the prerequisite for defeating it. Now look at what President Tinubu said in response. He called the attack particularly disturbing because the victims were killed for resisting an attempt to forced indoctrination. He called the attackers heartless and vowed they would be brought to justice. Kwara State Governor Abdulrahman Razak called it a brutal and deliberate massacre motivated by extremism rather than banditry. He visited Woro and Nuku the following day and described the massacre as a genocide. Then the Nigerian military deployed elite special troops and air power. Then the counter-terrorism analyst quoted by This Day Live wrote what needs to be said plainly. We have been deploying military battalions for almost a decade, yet the insurgency has metastasized from one state to half the country. This is the pattern this investigation has now documented across multiple investigations in this series. Presidential condemnation, troop deployment, security assurance, this cycle repeating, the territory continuing to be lost. Now examine the international dimension, because Nigeria is not fighting this alone, and the external interventions of 2025 and 2026 tell us something specific about where Nigeria's security capacity actually sits. On Christmas Day 2025, the United States launched Tomahawk missile strikes against ISWAP Lakurawa targets in Sokoto State. President Trump announced it on Truth Social with language this channel documented in the Clear investigation, claiming the strikes were targeting jihadists who had been killing Christians. AFRICOM Commander General Dagvin Anderson stated the military goal was to protect Americans and disrupt violent extremist organizations where they are. The Nigerian government said the strikes were jointly conducted with government approval following credible intelligence and careful operational planning. The Nigerian Information Minister confirmed the operation.
On February 3, 2026, 40 days after the Christmas Day strikes, the Waro and Nuku massacre happened. The strikes degraded the group's capacity in Sokoto. They did not stop the February advance into Kwara. On February 3, 2026, the same day as the Woro massacre, an advance team of U.S. soldiers arrived in Nigeria to train and advise the Nigerian military. By February 16, an additional 100 troops had been sent. A further 100 were expected by the end of the month. The United States is now training the Nigerian military inside Nigerian territory, while Nigerian communities are being massacred in Kwara State. The world's most powerful military is physically present in Nigeria, providing counter-terrorism assistance, and 162 people were still bound and shot at close range in a village that wrote letters to ask for protection for 5 months. The CSIS analysis published in February 2026 made the critical point that the U.S. military analyst community has been consistent about for years. One-time strikes need to be part of a larger campaign. What is not visible is that larger campaign. The economic factors, the governance vacuum, the ideological infrastructure that the insurgency draws from, none of these are addressed by Tomahawk missiles. This is the same analysis this channel made in the Boko Haram genealogy investigation. Military response addresses capability. It does not address the conditions that produced the capability. And in Nigeria, those conditions, the governance vacuum in northern states, the educational collapse that produced a generation outside Nigerian civic formation, the foreign religious financing infrastructure this channel traced to Saudi Arabia, are not being addressed by any currently visible Nigerian policy. The insurgency has metastasized from one state to half the country. U.S. troops are now training Nigerian soldiers on Nigerian soil, and the expansion continues. Now address the self-defense question directly, because it is in the title of this investigation and it deserves analytical precision rather than emotional response. The call for Nigerian communities to arm themselves and shoot back is coming from a specific political context. It is coming from communities that have written letters to the authorities asking for protection and watched the protection leave after a few weeks. It is coming from communities that have watched 162 of their neighbors bound and executed in February 2026. It is coming from communities that have watched the Nigerian military deploy, announce operations, and fail to prevent the next massacre. The frustration that produces the call for self-defense is completely understandable. In the specific human terms of a community watching itself be systematically destroyed while the state's protection is intermittent, inadequate, and unreliable, the call to arm and defend makes emotional and tactical sense. But this investigation must apply its analytical standard here, rather than simply validate the emotion. The arming of civilian communities in conflict zones with sophisticated weaponry and without command structure, rules of engagement, accountability mechanisms, and coordination with professional security forces does not produce defense. It produces escalation. It produces the conditions for communal violence in which armed groups and armed communities become indistinguishable to the security apparatus. It produces the conditions for ethnic conflict in which weapons acquired for defense against jihadists are used in old land disputes, resource conflicts, and historical grievances that the jihadist presence has reignited. The documented history of vigilante arming in conflict zones, the Civilian Joint Task Force in northeast Nigeria, the Amotekun experience in the southwest, the community militia responses across the Middle Belt, shows a consistent pattern. Vigilante arming degrades the jihadist threat in the short term in some cases. It creates new threats, new governance problems, and new human rights violations in the medium term in almost every case. The answer to inadequate state security is not the replacement of state security with armed civilians. The answer is accountable, adequately resourced, professionally conducted state security that operates under constitutional constraints and produces documented outcomes. Now, examine the political response with the precision it requires. President Tinubu ordered greater aerial surveillance and forest monitoring across Kwara, Kebbi, and Niger states following the Woro massacre. Elite special troops were deployed. Air power was roared across the skies. The Southern Governors Forum called for prosecution of the perpetrators. None of these responses addressed the documented structural conditions that produced the massacre. The Kainji National Park remains a 5,341 square kilometer sanctuary for the convergence of armed groups. No sustained clearing operation of that reserve has been announced or documented.
The Borgu region forest corridors that allow armed groups to cross state lines undetected remain unmonitored by any documented dedicated security mechanism. The Operation Safe Corridor graduates, as this channel documented in a previous investigation, remain in communities without monitoring mechanisms, without recidivism data, without individual accountability for specific acts of violence. The community warning systems, in which village heads write letters to authorities months in advance of documented attacks, remain disconnected from rapid deployment mechanisms that actually respond before the attack rather than after it. The ideological infrastructure, the madrasas, the foreign-funded theological networks, the Wahhabist formation that produces recruits for jihadist groups, remains unregulated by any Nigerian federal framework despite 18 years of documented evidence of its role in the insurgency's reproduction.
Between January and November 2025, at least 207 people were killed and more than 177 abducted across Kwara's northern areas. These were documented before the February 26 Woro massacre. The scale of violence in Kwara was visible, documented, and reported to authorities through the community warning letters, through state security assessments, through the research of Nigerian and international security analysts. The massacre happened anyway. And on March 21, 2026, 6 weeks after the Woro massacre, Elder Olayito Oyinzuber, coordinator of the Kwara South Joint Security Watch, issued a formal letter titled Urgent Imminent Terrorist Threats Alert. Another letter, another warning, another documented advance notice of what is coming. The question is whether this letter will also be followed by soldiers who deploy and then withdraw after a few weeks. Now, look at the broader national picture that the convergence of all these documented incidents produces. In January 2025, Open Doors ranked Nigeria as number 7 on the World Watch List, the annual ranking of countries where Christians face the most extreme persecution. In 2024, Open Doors estimated that 4,118 Christians were killed for their faith in Nigeria, the highest number globally. The Observatory for Religious Freedom in Africa, applying its own methodology, documented 16,769 Christians and 6,235 Muslims killed in the context of terror groups between October 2019 and September 2023. ACLD, applying its more conservative methodology, focused on attacks explicitly targeted by religious identity, found that out of more than 20,400 civilians killed between January 2020 and September 2025, 317 deaths were from attacks targeting Christians and 417 from attacks targeting Muslims. ACLD's senior Africa analyst has repeatedly noted that the claims of 100,000 Christians killed in Nigeria since 2009 are not supported by available data, and identifies the violence as driven by multiple overlapping causes: political power, land disputes, ethnicity, banditry, and religious extremism. This investigation has now cited all of the major data sources: Intersociety, Open Doors, ACLD, the Observatory for Religious Freedom in Africa, because this channel's analytical standard requires presenting the full evidentiary picture. The methodological differences between these organizations are real, significant, and explained by different definitions of what constitutes a religiously motivated attack, different verification standards, and different data collection methodologies in conflict zones where documentation is inherently incomplete. What all of the datasets agree on is this: the scale of killing in Nigeria is catastrophic. It has been growing over the period examined. The Northeast insurgency has metastasized geographically. Muslim and Christian communities are both being targeted. The state's response has been insufficient to reverse the trajectory, and the communities most affected are calling, with increasing urgency and decreasing confidence in any other option, for the right to defend themselves. That is not a Christian persecution narrative. That is not a Muslim aggression narrative. That is what the documented evidence across all the data sources that have examined it produces when you look at it without the ideological filter. Now, look at where this goes from here. The March 21st urgent security alert from Kwara South is the most immediate indicator. If the security apparatus responds to it with the sustained, documented, outcome-producing deployment that the Woro letters did not produce, watch for specific named operations, specific forest clearing activities in Kainji, specific documented arrests of commanders identified, then the Tinubu government will have demonstrated that February 3 was a turning point rather than a continuation. If the response is again troops deployed and withdrawn, aerial surveillance announced and discontinued, condemnations issued and forgotten, then the March 21st letter will join the archive of documented warnings that preceded documented massacres. Watch for whether the U.S. troop presence in Nigeria, currently training and advising the Nigerian military, produces a visible change in operational capacity against the forest sanctuaries. The American military's counter-terrorism institutional knowledge, applied to a theater where the geographic and logistical challenges are understood by Nigerian security analysts, could produce genuine tactical improvement. Or it could be another external intervention that degrades capability in one location while the groups reconstitute in the next forest over.
Watch for whether any Nigerian administration at the federal or state level produces a public, documented, independently verifiable strategic plan for the Kainji National Park Forest Sanctuary problem. Not a press release, not a deployment announcement, a strategy. With timelines, with named responsible commanders, with documented outcomes that can be assessed against the claimed objectives. Watch for the political response to the community calls for self-defense. If the federal government criminalizes the formation of community self-defense mechanisms without providing the alternative of genuine state security, it will drive the arming on the ground while making no improvement in protection. If it legitimizes community self-defense without providing the command structure, rules of engagement, and accountability mechanisms that prevent vigilante violence from producing new atrocities, it will have traded one security crisis for a different one. The most important long-term indicator is not military, it is governance. The communities of Waro and Nuku, of Oreke and Oreke Okegbo, of Edao Neo in Ekiti, the communities this channel has documented across this investigation and the previous one, are all located in territories where the Nigerian state's governance presence has been inadequate for years before the jihadist advance reached them. The jihadist groups did not create the governance vacuum, they exploited it. Closing the governance vacuum through sustained public service delivery, through functional local government, through the kind of civic infrastructure that gives communities institutional loyalty to the Nigerian state rather than vulnerability to the first armed group that offers them an alternative, is not a military task. It is a political one. And it is the task that 18 years of security operations have not been accompanied by Vagananslai. Here is the answer to the question this investigation opened with. Nigeria is at war. That is not alarmism. It is the documented conclusion of every major security assessment, every data organization, every community warning letter, and every massacre report reviewed for this investigation. The jihadist groups, Boko Haram, ISWAP, Lakurawa, and Saru, ISSP, are advancing geographically, building infrastructure in forest sanctuaries, issuing theological ultimatums to Muslim and Christian communities alike, and executing those who refuse submission. The Nigerian state's response has been characterized by 18 years of military deployments that degrade capability without addressing conditions, by political condemnations that produce press releases without security outcomes, by rehabilitation programs that return fighters to communities without monitoring, by warning systems that receive letters and withdraw their troops after a few weeks. The communities that are calling for the right to arm and shoot back are not being irrational. They are being rational in the face of a state that has not protected them.
The analytical argument is not that their call is wrong. The analytical argument is that their call is evidence of state failure, and that state failure, not civilian arming, is the problem that must be named and the accountability that must be demanded. 162 people were bound and shot in Waro and Nuku because the state received their letters and sent troops who left after the massacre. That is not a war that will be won by giving civilians guns. It will be won when the Nigerian state decides that the lives of the people of Waro and Nuku, Muslim, Christian, Yoruba, Hausa, Fulani, are worth the sustained, accountable, outcome-producing security commitment that those communities have been asking for in writing for years. The question is whether any Nigerian administration has ever made that decision, and whether the communities still alive to ask for it will still be there when one finally does. Here is my question for the comments. The jihadists sent letters to Woro 5 months before the massacre. The community wrote letters to the authorities. Troops were deployed and withdrew after a few weeks. 162 people were killed. Name one specific thing, one institutional change, one policy decision, one accountability measure that you believe would make the next community that writes a warning letter receive a different response from the Nigerian state. One specific thing. Drop it below. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.